So far, we've only looked at very fine-scale evolution, changes in gene frequency from one generation to the next. But today, I want to look at a much grander scale, and I want to look at big changes in lineages. So the origins of vision, whether in vertebrates or in insects, wings in insects again, and then feathers. These are extraordinary changes that have arisen through evolutionary time. And remember, all these different species ultimately have a common ancestor. So how do we get these very large-scale changes? Easiest way to think about it is in terms of directional selection, which is fundamental for adaptation. So if we have an environmental change, this can favor taller individuals, faster individuals, more colorful, so that they gain greater reproductive success. And the alleles that code for that favored trait become more and more common. So this we've already seen in terms of microevolution. But we want to see how the population will evolve towards an extreme through much longer time period. And so individuals will eventually become far better adapted to their new environment. So let's imagine we have a species that has a typical trait of a certain size. Let's let it be their beak, and beaks are moderate. And this is because in their environment, they eat fairly moderate-sized seeds. But if something happens to change the environment where now larger seeds are all that's available, those birds with the largest beaks who can handle the larger seeds will become favored, and the whole population will trend towards larger beaks. So that's an overall change in phenotype. That's directional selection brought on ultimately by an environmental change and the associated differential reproduction of larger individuals. So what we have then is the gene pool of the population where the traits that confer larger beaks may be relatively rare, but those individuals that possess them are favored, and the gene pool changes, so our genotype follows the change in the environment, thus coding for the change in the phenotype. So most adaptations that we find in nature are presumed to have resulted from this kind of directional selection. The environment changed some way that favored some new pattern in the organisms that lived there, and the population evolved. Now, macroevolution is looking at these sorts of changes on a grand scale. And we're looking at all the different populations of the same species, so ultimately everybody of a certain species has changed towards this new norm. So what we want to look at today is to really question the assumption of whether we are well equipped to understand the evolutionary process from our understanding of microevolution, Mendelian genetics, small gradual change. We want to know if macroevolution really is the outcome of microevolution extended over thousands of generations. And it was this kind of extrapolation, this assumption, that caused Darwin so much trouble, because he said, well, with enough time, any small change in an ancestral ape that favored greater intelligence or loss of hair or whatever it is that makes us human, eventually you'd see us linked to these earlier species. And so this gave rise to great skepticism when these ideas first came out. They're fairly accepted now, although all still is subject of a fair amount of well, shall we say, hilarity here, as we go from a bent-over ape to Homo erectus back to Homo computericus or something, or Homo obesicus, okay? But the idea is that we would have a continual change through a lot of intermediate steps to get to what doesn't look very much like the ancestor at all. So Darwin's view of macroevolution is that physical traits change very gradually. So that microevolutionary process, a slight increase in size, a slight increase in coloration from one generation to the next. And then over vast periods of time, these small changes will produce profound physical differences. And the final product may not look at all like the ancestor. But for this to be true, for this process to have really driven selection to go from a precursor to something that's quite different in the end, each intermediate step must have had an advantage over the previous generation. So the slightly larger individual had an advantage every generation. This keeps going and keeps going. So when you look at modern organisms and see some of the very, very complex organs that are now normal traits for species like us, it seems quite extraordinary that this kind of gradual change is even feasible. And Darwin recognized this himself, and the organ that he chose to emphasize was the eyeball. And he said, as written here on the right, that to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. I mean, how could you get something so incredibly accurate in being able to focus images onto a screen at the back of the eye in dim light, bright light, near distant, far distant, when intermediate steps would seem not to be very useful at all? So Darwin then went on, as a challenge to his own ideas. He said, look, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, in fact, a lot of modern critics of Darwinian evolution have seized on precisely this concern raised by Darwin himself. And a lot of these critics come from fundamentalist religious groups. Here's one from the Muslim world, Harun Yahya, who has written a lot of books saying all kinds of extraordinary things like Darwinism is on the retreat and can no longer deceive the world. He says that Darwinism claims that intermediate fossils exist when they do not. He flatly denies that there are any intermediate fossils. Okay? In the Christian world, we have creationists. Here's a creationist scientist from the early part of the 20th century, the father of the modern creationism movement, and he's written with bold assertion, he says, the billions of known fossils have not yet yielded a single unequivocal transitional form. Okay? Now, it's extraordinary that these guys can make these claims, and that's just the way they are, but the fact is that they're seizing on that idea that if large-scale evolutionary change, going from no eyeballs to having really accurate, good, valuable eyeballs, couldn't happen, then all the ideas we're teaching in this course are suspect. So, what I want to do here is to contrast two radically different ideas about evolution of the eye. And one will take intelligent design, which is promoted by a lot of religious groups, who say that some of these organs, like the eye, are so incredibly complicated, they could not come into existence piecemeal, bit by bit, through gradual change. They must have been the result of a divine creator who guided evolution. Okay? On contrast, let's stick with Darwin, and let's actually take seriously the idea that a very complex organ could evolve from a very simple precursor through natural selection. So, the idea behind intelligent design is that the eye is so complex, it has so many parts, it must have been designed by a higher power rather than have resulted from random mutation. I mean, surely having the iris here that lets in different amounts of light, having the lens focused near and far depending on what you're looking at, and having all these bits and pieces of the eye, how could they all have come into existence just by random mutation? Okay? They have this notion that there's no use in having an eye if you only have part of an eye. Half of an eye is not nearly as useful as you might think. You have to have all or nothing. Now, if we evaluate these alternatives, we have on the one hand intelligent design that asks, how could evolution, acting on one gene at a time, start with a sightless organism and produce an eye with so many independent parts. They will keep using this term irreducible complexity. This feature, this physical characteristic is so complicated. It's so much greater than the sum of its parts. You couldn't have got there through intermediate steps. It was all or nothing. Well, natural selection, on the other hand, we reckon that, well, think of any given species on Earth, and there's millions of individuals in the population. And over thousands of generations, with a constant small mutation rate, there will always be a series of mutations, and some of them, by chance, may slightly improve vision. And each one of these components of vision, whether it's being able to focus, to be able to view at night, to be able to see colors, these can all evolve simultaneously. And slight improvements in one component can allow for improvements to catch up in some other component. So, how would we actually test between these? Well, the simplest way is to actually look at the complex organ in question, the eye, and point out that, well, it's not actually that well designed. The eye has a lot of weak spots in it, which imply evolution from a simpler precursor. And one of the easiest things to notice in your own vision is that you have a blind spot. You can cover up one eye, and somewhere a little off here somewhere, you can't see the details. And that's because that's where your optic nerve comes from the brain into the retina. And there's no photoreceptors right there, so you have a blind spot. Furthermore, our retinas, which are really, really good, we have very accurate vision, but the retina in all vertebrates, us, birds, mammals, face backwards. The actual photoreceptors are pointing back, and the light has to pass through those cells and bounce back so the retinas can actually capture the light. Okay? Furthermore, the way the image gets from the eyes to the brain is very kind of jerry-built. The optic nerves don't make a straight path. They go through various intersections. There's various way stations on the way, and all of these show pre-existing forms that have been co-opted, now they're used for something else. And so what we have here is actually a lot of history. What we have is signs that this is an organ that developed from precursors and has gotten elaborated and is more complex than the original. So complex organs turn out to be jerry-built from whatever parts were previously available. Now, in contrast, if we think about how evolution could proceed from very simple precursors, we can actually look for examples in nature of very simple visual systems. And it turns out within the mollusks, there is an incredible diversity of sight organs. And at the simplest end of the spectrum are these pigment spots found in organisms called limpets. And these just consist of a few cells that are photoreceptors. They don't have a lens, they don't have an iris, just a few cells that can detect light and dark, and they connect back to the organism's brain. In certain kinds of mollusks, this photoreceptor layer is now shaped. So instead of it just being a flat surface, it's a cup. And this actually allows a little bit more directionality of where is the light or where are the dark. Then we have also, again in mollusks, and this is from a nautilus, we have this cup of the photoreceptors, but now there's an outer surface that filters the light before it comes in and hits the photoreceptor layer. Okay? And then in a different kind of marine snail, there is again this series of photoreceptors, the cup shape, and now there's a cover in front of it, and there is a very simple refractive lens. So this will direct the light's rays onto the surface of the retina. And finally, in the mollusks, the most wonderful member of that whole group is the octopus. And the octopus has a very well-defined retina. Now it has a lens that's attached, so it can focus near and far, and it's got an iris. It's got all these features that we associate with our own eyes. And this is an entirely separate lineage from vertebrates. These, as we'll see later in the course, are not showing these same traits by common ancestry, but this is parallel evolution. So, what we have are these limpets with a very simple photoreceptor, these slit shell mollusks with a cupped receptor. Here's a nautilus that has the pinhole lens, this murex that has the beginnings of a lens or a simple lens, and then there's our real superstar, the octopus. So these mollusks have a diversity of visual systems, and it turns out that they have the vision, pretty much all the vision that they need. So limpets, which just have that simple photoreceptor layer, they don't move. They stay put. They attach themselves to boulders and to reefs, and they just need to know, is it light or is it dark? If it's light, there's more plankton, they can be doing more hunting, or that is filtering the food. That's all they need to know, is it light or dark? With the abalone, this is a stationary predator. It has a very simple eye, and it only needs to detect, is there something nearby? If there's something that's moved into my vision, I'll just grab for it. That's all I need to be able to do. A snail, although we think of snails as being pretty slow foragers, they do move, and they need to know where they're going. So they have to have a rough idea of what the environment's going to be like up ahead. And the octopus, which has eyes as sharp and as accurate as ours, they're a mobile predator. They're going to grab things with their tentacles. They need to know how far away it is, and they need to be able to see in bright light and dim light. So they need to be able to detect and capture fast-moving prey. Now, getting back to that whole question of intelligent design versus natural selection, if we look at the vertebrate eye, the optic nerve actually extends out to reach to the eye, and then these nerve fibers point backwards towards this reflective surface, and the retina therefore is backwards, okay? And we also have the blind spot. So in contrast, the mollusks, with that great champion, the octopus, with a very, very accurate eye, it's pretty much the same set of bits and pieces, but with the molluscan eye, the retina points forwards. So their eyes are much more efficient than the human eye. The light goes directly onto the retina. It doesn't have to pass through and bounce back. And they don't have a blind spot either. So the mollusks would have to be the ones that, if you were going to say somebody was going to design a really good eye, then they designed the octopus eye. But also we know that these came through intermediate steps. So in both cases, the Darwinian view of gradual change is actually confirmed when you study the details of the physiology of these complex organs. Now, in a Darwinian world, in thinking about how these eyes could start out very simple, from a photoreceptor patch, through a cup, through having a lens, etc., etc. This is an attempt by some evolutionary biologists playing around on some computers and imagining that each genetic change will only alter the underlying trait by a little bit. And they've done simulation models to suggest that it would take about 180 mutations to get to this stage, 800 to get to this stage, 1250 to here, and after 1800 small gradual changes, you would have an eye as complex as a modern vertebrate eyeball. So that if it was truly incremental change, one small change after another, it would only take about 1800 mutations to go from the simplest photoreceptor to a complex eye with all the features of our modern eyes. Now, we know from the fossil record that however this process occurred, it all happened a long time ago, and our iris, lens, and retina all evolved by about 500 million years ago. So, given that we see the ability of a trait to become more complex, why doesn't every species have eyes just as complex as ours? I mean, why do those limpets just settle for such a simple eye? Even though they only need to know light and dark, wouldn't it be great for them to have a much more complex eye? Well, we can study a little bit about this by asking, where has vision been lost? And in species that live underground, this is an animal we'll be looking at a lot over the rest of the course. It's called the naked mole rat. It lives underground. It never comes up to the surface, so its world is completely dark. And it's lost its eyes. So have cave fish and cave salamanders. They no longer have eyes in the way that their ancestors did. But they do still have kind of vestigial organs. They've kind of reverted back to the simplest photoreceptors. They can still detect light and dark. And presumably that helps them from venturing out into bright areas where they'd be really vulnerable to predators. So by still being able to tell light from dark, that's all they need. But why is it that this has gone back? Well, it turns out that eyes are very energetically expensive. Looking around, absorbing the information that you're seeing, that takes a lot of energy. And if you don't need to expend that energy, then there's no reason to have the trait. And furthermore, the eye is such a complex organ with specialized cells that these have associated diseases like glaucoma and even retinal cancer and tumors. So having an organ that you don't use that's prone to life-threatening disease is a good reason for natural selection to eradicate the trait when it's no longer needed.